On that Wednesday afternoon, Grant was lying beneath Mrs. Henderson's old Buick, checking the oil filter, while the neighborhood carried on as usual. Birds chirped in the trees, children played in the park, and Helen had gone to Palmer's Market to catch the senior discount. The air was tinged with the first hint of autumn, leaves beginning to crinkle underfoot. Then the tranquility shattered. The first sign was the screech of tires, too loud, too aggressive for their quiet street. Grant rolled out from under the car, a wrench still in his hand, just as the first black SUV came to a halt at the end of his driveway. Three more followed, their tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Grant squinted, engine grease staining his fingers. His heart kicked into gear, a sensation he hadn't felt since his last classified mission. He dropped the wrench, raised his hands, and waited. The storm had arrived. A 68-year-old retired military operative living a quiet life in the suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Drive. Establish his routine, fixing cars for neighbors, volunteering at the VFW, teaching auto mechanics at the local high school. Highlight his unassuming nature, the respect he has from the community, and his close bond with his wife, Linda, renamed to Helen. Grant dropped to his knees, his hands raised high as the SWAT team swarmed his driveway. Boots pounded the pavement. Black-clad officers with tactical gear and mirrored visors surrounded him, rifles pointed like spears. "There's some mistake," Grant tried to say, but the words caught in his throat as a heavy boot pressed down on his back, forcing him face first into the concrete. Gravel bit into his cheek, and the scent of motor oil mixed with the sharp tang of sweat. "Zip tie him," a voice barked. Within seconds, Grant's wrists were bound behind his back. He strained against the restraints, testing their strength, but years of military training had taught him when to resist and when to stay still. "Clear the house," another officer shouted, and Grant's stomach clenched. Helen. She was still out at Palmer's Market. Relief mixed with dread. What would happen if she returned now? The answer came too soon. The sound of tires screeching, rubber burning against asphalt. Grant craned his neck and saw Helen's car pulling into the driveway. She stepped out, her arms filled with grocery bags, a look of confusion creasing her brow. "Grant? What's going?" "Ma'am, drop the bags, hands where we can see them." A younger officer, eyes wide and jaw clenched, stepped forward, gun drawn. Helen hesitated, her eyes darting between Grant on the ground and the officers advancing toward her. "Please," Grant tried to say, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. "She's my wife." "Ma'am, final warning." The officer's voice cracked, his knuckles white around the handle of his taser. Helen's arthritic hands trembled as she began to lower the bags. Apples tumbled out, rolling across the pavement. The officer moved forward, his taser raised. The moment stretched like a rubber band, tension winding tighter. "Step back, old man, or you're next," the officer sneered, his face red beneath his helmet. The taser fired. Helen's body jerked as the electric current ripped through her, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The bags dropped, and groceries exploded across the driveway. Eggs splattering, milk pooling, cans rolling beneath tactical boots. Grant's heart thundered in his chest as Helen collapsed, her body hitting the ground like a rag doll. His vision blurred with rage, but he forced himself to remain still, fists clenched behind his back. "Let me up," he said, his voice calm, deadly. The commander, a man with a hardened jaw and sharp eyes, stepped forward, brow furrowed. "What did you say?" "Call General Marcus Gray, right now," Grant said, each word clipped, precise. The commander blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "I'll verify it." Grant shifted his gaze to his unconscious wife, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. "You tased a 65-year-old woman with a heart condition." The older SWAT member, the one who had been eyeing Grant curiously since the beginning, stepped forward. "Sir, maybe we should check his ID." "Left inside pocket," Grant said, voice still steady. "Look, but don't touch." The commander hesitated, then reached into Grant's jacket pocket, withdrawing a worn metallic badge bearing the Black Eagle insignia, a symbol known only to those familiar with Tier 1 operations. The older officer's face paled. "Sir, that's not just military. That's classified." The commander's posture shifted, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Medic! Get a medic over here!" he shouted, his voice cracking as the weight of the situation finally sank in. Grant's eyes remained fixed on Helen, lying motionless amidst spilled groceries and shattered eggshells. The storm was only just beginning, shouting commands. Grant is forced to the ground, hands zip-tied behind his back. Helen arrives home with groceries, confused and alarmed. A young officer, anxious and inexperienced, escalates the situation and tases Helen despite her compliance. Groceries spill across the driveway and Helen collapses, her heart condition exacerbated. Grant remains calm and collected, using the military discipline still ingrained in him. He says the 5 words that change everything. Call General Rohr right now. Sir, that's not just military, that's classified. The older SWAT officer's whisper hung heavy in the air. The commander's expression shifted from confusion to realization as he held the worn metallic badge in his gloved hands. The Black Eagle insignia gleamed under the afternoon sun, a symbol that carried more weight than any standard military rank. What? What is this? The commander muttered, his gaze locked onto Grant. It's called Black Protocol Clearance, Grant said evenly. It means I know things that don't officially exist. The SWAT team fell silent. Even the radios seemed to hush, as if the air itself had grown still in the presence of a man who had once operated in shadows so deep that even light feared to reach them. You hit the wrong house, Grant said, his voice calm but cold. I told you. Address confirmed, sir, the younger officer said, swallowing hard. The target was supposed to be 4588 Oakwood Avenue. Not Drive, Grant added. Your target isn't here, but my wife is. Now, if you're done playing soldier, I need to get to her. The commander stepped back, signaling to the team to lower their weapons. Grant flexed his wrists against the zip ties, the plastic biting into his skin. Cut these! The commander nodded. The older SWAT officer stepped forward, pulling out a knife and slicing through the restraints. Grant's hands fell free, and he wasted no time kneeling beside Helen, brushing strands of gray hair from her face. Helen? He whispered, fingers gently tapping her cheek. Helen, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered and she groaned softly. Relief washed over Grant, but anger simmered just beneath the surface. Medic! The commander barked, his voice no longer carrying the bravado of moments earlier. Get a medic over here. 2 medics rushed forward, one kneeling beside Helen and checking her pulse. The other glanced nervously at Grant, recognizing the insignia on the badge now lying beside him on the ground. Sir, the older SWAT officer said, his voice tight. That badge, you don't just hand those out. No, Grant said, eyes fixed on Helen as the medics worked. You don't. The commander swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to regain control of the situation. Look, Mr. West, we were given intel that Carlos Mendez was hiding out here, a high-level drug trafficker connected to a cartel. We acted on that intel. You acted on bad intel, Grant corrected, and you escalated against a civilian without confirming the address. You tased a 65-year-old woman because your man couldn't handle his adrenaline. The young officer who had fired the taser stood frozen, face ashen. Grant's words hit him like a blow, and he visibly recoiled. Grant met his eyes, holding his gaze until the young man looked away, shame evident in every tense muscle. What's the ETA on that General Gray call? The commander snapped, turning to his communications officer. Inbound, the officer said, his hand pressed to his earpiece. He's en route now. Grant rose to his feet, the tension radiating off him like heat waves. The SWAT team seemed to shrink in his presence. The older officer stepped forward, his eyes locked on Grant. Sir, he said, lowering his voice, your name wouldn't happen to be Grant West, would it? Grant's jaw clenched. It would. The officer nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the badge in Grant's hand. I served with a man named West once. He was a legend in the unit, a ghost who could move through enemy lines without a sound. They said he could dismantle a bomb with his eyes closed. They called him the Phantom. Grant didn't respond. The officer's eyes widened slightly. That was you, wasn't it? Grant said nothing, his silence a confirmation more damning than any words. Sir, the medic called, looking up from Helen. She's stable, but we need to get her to a hospital for further evaluation. Grant nodded, his hand gripping Helen's tightly. I'm going with her. The commander stepped forward, clearly torn between protocol and the growing realization that he was in over his head. Mr. West, Grant, Grant stood, towering over the man who had just minutes ago held him down with a boot to the back. "Save it. You've done enough." The older SWAT officer watched Grant, a mixture of fear and respect evident in his eyes, unsure of the significance of Grant's demand. Grant instructs him to check the address and to look inside his jacket pocket. The commander retrieves a worn badge bearing the Black Eagle insignia, a symbol of top-tier classified operations. The older SWAT member recognizes the badge and whispers to the commander, causing an immediate shift in power dynamics. Grant is released, and the medics are called to assist Helen, who is now conscious but shaken. As they wait for further instructions, the commander is informed that they raided the wrong house. Their target, Carlos Mendez, was located on Oakwood Avenue, not Oakwood Drive. The hum of the engine was the only sound as the black SUV rolled up to the curb, coming to a smooth stop behind the cluster of SWAT vehicles. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just the quiet, controlled arrival of a man who didn't need noise to command attention. The driver stepped out first, scanning the perimeter before moving to the back door. When it opened, General Marcus Gray emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair cut to precise regulation length. His charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, spoke of a man who no longer wore military uniforms, but still carried the authority of a man who once did. Gray surveyed the scene with a gaze honed by decades of assessing battlefields and tactical operations. His eyes moved from the SWAT commander, who was already striding toward him, to Grant West, who was now standing beside the medic tending to Helen. Grant's expression was stony, a simmering storm behind his eyes. "Sir, the SWAT commander began, but Gray lifted a single hand, silencing him without a word. The commander's mouth snapped shut as if he'd been physically struck. Gray's eyes locked onto Grant's. For a long, tense moment, neither man spoke. Then, with deliberate formality, General Gray raised his right hand in a crisp salute. Grant returned it, his own salute just as sharp, just as precise. It was the first salute he'd given in over 15 years. "They told me you were dead," Gray said, voice flat, eyes never leaving Grant's face. "Only professionally," Grant replied. Gray's gaze flicked to Helen, lying on the stretcher, an oxygen mask over her mouth. A muscle in his jaw twitched, a sign of restrained fury. He turned back to the SWAT commander. "What do you call this?" "Sir, we had intel," the commander stammered, his face flushing. "A high-level target, Carlos Mendez, was supposed to be hiding out at 4588 Oakwood Avenue." "And this," Gray said, gesturing to the driveway filled with shattered eggs, spilled milk, and the scattered remains of groceries. "Does this look like Oakwood Avenue to you?" The commander's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No, sir." Gray stepped closer, his face inches from the commander's. "You tased a 65-year-old woman with a heart condition because your rookie couldn't handle the sight of a bag of apples. And you zip-tied a man whose name you clearly didn't bother to run." The commander tried to speak, but Gray's voice thundered over him. "You didn't detain a suspect today. You humiliated a national asset, a man whose operational experience likely exceeds your entire team's combined." The older SWAT officer, the one who had recognized Grant's badge, took a half-step back. "Sir, he's the Phantom." Gray's eyes narrowed. "You don't say." The young officer who had fired the taser stood trembling, his hands clasped tightly together. Gray's gaze zeroed in on him. "You, equipment, now." The young officer's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. The neighborhood watched from behind drawn curtains and cracked doors, catching glimpses of a man whose power radiated without the need for weapons. Gray turned back to Grant, his expression softening just slightly. "Marcus," Grant said, his voice finally breaking through the ice. "Can I take her inside now?" Gray nodded, stepping aside. "Of course." Grant moved to the medic's side, reaching for Helen's hand. Her eyes fluttered open, and her gaze met his. "Grant?" "I'm here," he said, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I'm right here." Gray watched them for a moment, then turned to the commander. "You and your team will remain here until further notice. We're going to have a very long discussion about protocol." The commander nodded, his face ashen, as Gray stepped toward the SUV. From inside his suit jacket, he withdrew a sealed envelope and placed it on the porch railing. "Grant," he said, his voice lower now, "before I go, This contains two things: a formal apology from the department and a reinstatement of your clearances. Grant didn't move to take it. I'm not that man anymore. Maybe not, Gray said, his eyes darkening. But the world hasn't gotten any safer. Grant said nothing. Gray exhaled, looking back at Helen before meeting Grant's eyes one last time. The offer stands. With that, General Marcus Gray walked back to the SUV, his back straight, his shoulders squared. As the vehicle pulled away, the neighborhood returned to its uneasy silence. But in the wake of the storm, one thing was clear. The Phantom was not dead, and the world had just been reminded of what a man like Grant West could do if pushed. Grant's former superior arrives in a black SUV, flanked by two intelligence agents. He and Grant share a silent, loaded moment, a salute exchanged between former comrades. General Gray reprimands the SWAT commander, reminding him that Grant West is not just a civilian, but a national asset. The young officer who tased Helen is relieved of duty on the spot, his tactical gear and badge confiscated. General Gray presents Grant with an envelope containing two documents: a formal apology from the department and an offer to reinstate his clearances and return to service. Grant refuses, stating that his days of serving the country are over. His duty now is to Helen and to his community. The days after the incident passed in a blur. Helen rested on the living room couch, her chest wrapped in a compression bandage, her skin still mottled with bruises from the taser's impact. Grant hovered close, moving from the kitchen to the couch, bringing tea, adjusting pillows, and checking her pulse more often than necessary. "You're fussing," Helen said, managing a weak smile as Grant set down another cup of chamomile tea. "I call it caring," Grant replied, his jaw tight. He couldn't shake the image of her collapsing in the driveway, her body seizing under the electric current, the groceries spilling like shrapnel across the pavement. It replayed every time he closed his eyes. Outside, Oakwood Drive had returned to its usual, sleepy pace, but it wasn't the same. Neighbors who once waved at Grant now glanced away, uncertainty clouding their eyes. Word had spread quickly. The man who could fix anything with an engine was also the man who had once been a military ghost, a shadow operative. Grant tried to resume his routine. Mrs. Henderson's Buick still needed its oil change, so he worked in the garage with the radio playing low. But the noise wasn't enough to drown out the whispers. "But you're not," Grant swallowed, looking away. "I should have protected you." Helen's hand squeezed his. "You did. You kept your cool. You got them to stand down. You did what you had to." "But I should have done more," Grant said, his fist clenching. "I could have stopped them." "And what then?" Helen's eyes were soft but firm. "You would have been the one in the hospital, or worse." Grant stood, pacing the length of the room. "I never wanted this life for you. I never wanted you to see that part of me." Helen watched him, her gaze steady. "Grant, I know who you are. I knew it the day we met. You're not the Phantom to me. You're the man who fixed my car in the middle of a rainstorm, who stayed up all night waiting for me to come home from work, who taught those kids at the high school that they were worth something. That's who you are." Grant's shoulders sagged, the weight of years pressing down on him. "I don't know how to be that man anymore. Not when everyone's looking at me like I'm a threat." "Then show them," Helen said, patting the spot beside her. "Show them the man I know." Later that evening, Grant returned to the garage, staring at the envelope General Gray had left on the porch. It sat unopened on his workbench, the edges crisp and pristine. I just wanted to apologize for what I did." Grant said nothing, crossing his arms over his chest. "I was scared," the rookie continued, his eyes downcast. I thought she was reaching for something. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Grant said, his tone flat. "Yes, sir, I did." The rookie swallowed hard. "They're sending me to desk duty. Might be permanent. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm trying to be better." Grant studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Finally, he stepped forward, standing inches away from the young man. "You know how to change the oil in a Buick?" The rookie blinked, confused. No, sir." "Then come inside, I'll show you." The rookie's eyes widened. You're going to teach me?" "If you're willing to learn," Grant said, turning back toward the car. Now get to work. The rookie followed, his steps hesitant, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Grant handed him a wrench, and together they worked beneath the Buick, the garage filled with the scent of motor oil and the hum of classic rock. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson watched from her porch, a small smile touching her lips. Grant was still the man who fixed things, even the things that seemed beyond repair. Physically and emotionally scarred by the incident, Grant resumes his routine, but now the neighborhood watches him differently, with a mixture of awe, respect, and fear. The police department announces a new 5 words protocol, emphasizing de-escalation and civilian respect, without directly naming Grant or Helen. Grant is quietly approached by local officers seeking advice and mentorship, but he remains distant, preferring to focus on repairing cars and spending time with Helen. The tension simmers as Grant tries to maintain a semblance of normalcy while being treated as a living legend. 3 weeks after the incident, the air in Oakwood Drive remained tense. The neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, lawnmowers droning, children playing, porch lights flickering on at dusk. But the presence of Grant West loomed large, a silent ghost haunting the sidewalks. Grant himself kept to the garage, working on Mrs. Henderson's Buick with the rookie officer by his side. They worked mostly in silence, the only sounds the clank of tools and the muffled tunes of classic rock from the old radio. "Pass me the socket wrench," Grant said, his voice flat. The rookie, whose name was Adam, scrambled to comply, his hands shaking as he handed over the tool. Grant took it without looking up, tightening the bolt with practiced precision. "You ever change a tire before?" Grant asked. "No, sir," Adam said, his face flushed. "But I want to learn." "Good, why?" Grant said. "Because you're going to do the next one." It was nearing midnight when Grant heard the familiar rumble of an SUV outside. The neighborhood was cloaked in shadows, streetlights casting long, eerie fingers across the pavement. Grant stood in the garage, the scent of motor oil and cold coffee hanging heavy in the air. The unopened envelope still sat on the workbench, its edges curled now from days of neglect. "I don't know." Before Helen could respond, the garage door opened fully, and General Marcus Gray stepped inside, his imposing figure cutting a dark silhouette against the moonlight. In his hand, he held a sealed manila folder, thicker than the envelope on the workbench. "Can we talk?" Gray said, his eyes fixed on Grant. "You never seem to ask, Marcus," Grant said, crossing his arms. Gray glanced at Helen, his expression softening. "Helen, I'm sorry to bother you so late." "I was just going to bed," Helen said, her gaze flitting between the two men. "Don't keep him long, Marcus." Gray nodded. "I won't." Once she was gone, Gray stepped forward, placing the folder on the workbench beside the envelope. "You need to see this." Grant eyed the folder but didn't move. "I told you I'm done." "You're not done," Gray said, his voice low. "You're just hiding." Grant's fist clenched. "I have a life here. A wife who was tased in her own driveway by one of your men." "I know, and I'm sorry," Gray said, his jaw tight. "But you also know that the world doesn't stop just because you hang up your boots." Grant said nothing, eyes fixed on the folder. "They're called Red Flag," Gray said, tapping the folder. "A domestic terrorist cell, ex-military, ex-intel. They know our playbook because they used to be us. And now they're hitting government installations, weapons depots, communication centers, and they're planning a third strike." Grant swallowed, but his face remained stony. "What does that have to do with me?" "They're using your old tactics, Grant," Gray said, his voice hardening. "The ones you wrote. They're moving like phantoms, slipping through security, hitting targets, and disappearing without a trace. They're using your blueprints." Grant's jaw worked, muscles clenching. "Then you should know how to stop them." "We can't," Gray said, his eyes darkening. "Not without you." "You don't need me," Grant said, turning away. "You just want me." "No," Gray said, stepping forward, his voice a low growl. "I need you because you know how these men think. You train them. They're your ghosts, Grant." Grant's chest rose and fell, his breath coming faster. Images flashed through his mind. Dark rooms, flickering screens, men in black gear, their faces obscured by masks, just like the ones who had swarmed his driveway. Just like the ones who had tased Helen. "I can't," Grant said, his voice breaking. "I can't go back to that." Gray studied him, eyes narrowed. The memories swirled. The missions, the blood, the men he'd lost, the men he'd saved. A soft creak pulled him back. Helen stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed, her arms wrapped around herself. "What's going on, Grant?" Grant swallowed, his throat dry. Helen watched him, worry lines etched deep into her forehead. Grant placed the box on the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and opened it. Inside was a framed photograph, a younger Grant, standing amidst a group of men in black tactical gear. Their faces were blurred, all except his. His own face was marked by a grim expression, eyes dark, jaw set. There was a note beneath the frame, 2 words written in block letters. "Still watching." Grant's blood ran cold. "What is it?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. Grant placed the frame back in the box and closed it. A shadow fell across the driveway. Grant looked up to see Adam, the rookie officer, standing there, his cap in hand. "You said you'd teach me how to change the oil," Adam said, eyes pleading. Grant nodded, gesturing to the garage. "Come on in." They worked in silence, the clank of tools and the hum of the radio filling the void. But the photograph remained in the back of Grant's mind, and the men whose faces he could still remember, even after all these years, because somewhere out there, they were still watching. There's a new threat, a domestic terrorist group with military-grade weapons. Grant refuses, emphasizing that his days of service are over and that his duty now is to Helen. Gray leaves, but a package is left on the porch. A restored photograph of a younger Grant with his old unit, all faces but his blurred out. That night, Grant sits with Helen, finally opening up about some of his classified missions. The story ends with Grant teaching another auto shop class, a new student entering. The young officer who had tased Helen, seeking a second chance and a way to learn from the man he once wronged. Adam swallowed but nodded, moving to the rear tire. Grant stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest as he watched the young man fumble with the lug nuts. There was a time when he would have torn into Adam, berated him for his clumsiness. It was a look he was used to now, half fear, half awe. The whole neighborhood had seen the video. They'd all heard him say those 5 words and watched the SWAT team drop their weapons. Grant West, the man who could fix anything, had become something else entirely. A man who could command armies with a single sentence. "Mr. West," Adam said, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Ask," Grant said, keeping his eyes on the tire. "Everyone at the station talks about you," Adam said. "About what happened. About how you could have ended my career with a single call. Why didn't you?" Grant's jaw clenched. "Because revenge doesn't fix engines, and it doesn't fix people either." Adam nodded, a flush creeping up his neck. "Thank you, sir." Grant grunted a non-committal sound and moved to the workbench. Before he could grab the next tool, a shadow fell over the garage entrance. "You going to keep ignoring me, Grant?" Grant turned to see General Marcus Gray standing in the driveway, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Adam stiffened, eyes darting between the 2 men. "Go inside," Grant said to Adam. "I'll finish up." Adam hesitated, then set the wrench down and disappeared inside the house. General Gray stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the garage. The workbench cluttered with tools, the unopened envelope still sitting on the counter, the photo of Grant's old unit taped to the wall, edges worn and yellowed. "You gonna open that?" Gray asked, nodding to the envelope. "Nope," Grant said, wiping his hands on a rag. Gray sighed, stepping closer. "You know what's in it, a formal apology, a request to return to service." "I don't need an apology," Grant said, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "And I'm not going back." "You haven't even heard what we need you for," Gray said, his voice lowering. "It's bad, Grant. Domestic cell, military-grade weapons. They've already hit 2 targets, and they're planning a 3rd. We need someone who understands their playbook, someone who can think like them." "Find someone else," Grant said, turning away. "Grant, you wrote the playbook," Gray said, his voice hardening. "You know these tactics better than anyone alive." Grant's shoulders tensed. "I have a wife to take care of." "We can protect her," Gray said, stepping closer. "But if we don't stop these guys, no one will be safe. Not Helen, not you, not anyone." Grant stared at the wall, his jaw working. The memories flooded back. The missions without names, the men without faces, the nights spent waiting in darkened rooms, finger resting on the trigger. "I said no," Grant said, his voice flat. "Now get off my property." Gray stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but when they come knocking, and they will, don't say I didn't warn you." Gray turned and walked back to the SUV, his shoulders stiff, his stride purposeful. Grant's response is broadcast widely, leading to a renewed public interest in his story. Despite his efforts to avoid the spotlight, Grant becomes a reluctant hero, his words serving as a lesson in restraint and real power.